and welcome to everyone here this evening. My name is Karen Stiller, and I'm the Senior Director of Jewish Affairs at JCRC Bay Area, which is the largest collective voice of Bay Area Jews. Tonight's webinar is the second webinar in a series examining the mental health impacts of anti-Semitism. The rise of anti-Semitism, not only over the past 2 years, which has been really dramatic, but really over the last decade, has been taking an enormous toll on the Jewish community. And given the pervasiveness of anti-Semitism historically, we know that this problem is not going away anytime soon. Right now, we're hearing a very robust debate in the Jewish community about the best ways to address the anti-Semitism crisis, from focusing on building strong Jewish identity and Jewish resilience to tackling it square on with educational, legal, and other means. But what we're here to talk about tonight is something a little different, which is addressing the psychological impact on the Jewish community, which is not well known. And while awareness is starting to build, there's a number of initiatives across the country that provide support. Much more needs to be done. And the first step in addressing this crisis is understanding the scope of the problem. And last month's webinar featured Dr. Leah Hibble talking about her groundbreaking study of California Jewish families, which showed significant increases in anxiety and depression symptoms due to anti-Semitism. Tonight, we're going to drill down into really what those mental health impacts actually look like in real life. And I'm really thrilled to have here with me today Dr. Joshua Simmons. He's a psychologist, Jungian psychoanalyst, a clinical supervisor, and a published author with 2 decades of experience working with individuals, couples, and groups. He serves on the Collaborative of Jewish Psychologists and the American Psychological Association, and he maintains a private practice in San Francisco. So welcome to you, Josh. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Please note that we'll have time at the end for questions. Put your questions in the Q&A function, and my colleague Tal Garner will be collecting questions, and we will try to answer as many of those questions that you put in there as we have time for. So let's get started. Before we talk about your clinical work, let's find out a little bit more about you. I know you've described yourself as, quote, an October 8th Jew. Can you tell us, like, what does that mean, and how did that spur you to really focus on anti-Semitism?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me, Karen. It's good to be here with you and the rest of our community. The concept of an October 8th Jew is something that was coined by Bret Stephens in November 2023, and I can certainly speak to it through my own lens. Prior to October 7th, I had no connection to Jewish communal life here in the Bay Area. I grew up on the East Coast with an Israeli parent and attending Jewish day school. And when I look back, I see that I rarely had to defend my Judaism or Zionism. They were so deeply internalized, just so fundamental to my being. I never felt the need to wear it, to display it, or even actively practice it. And then October 7th happened, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that my life was totally turned upside down. I lost several close long-term relationships due to anti-Semitism. I saw the Psychoanalytic Institute that I had been a member of for over 20 years fail to maintain any sense of neutrality as it pertained to Hamas's attack and the subsequent war in Gaza. I lost mentors and colleagues. So it hit me very personally and directly. So, because of this experience and because of what I was witnessing around me in San Francisco, I felt my own kind of inner mandate to take my skill set and do something, really anything, because I felt so helpless. So, I connected with the Association of Jewish Psychologists, who had identified something of a mental health crisis brewing on college campuses amongst Jewish students with the rise of anti-Semitic activity and the encampments. AJP began to offer free weekly virtual support groups to any Jewish student who was in need of support. But what they soon realized that it wasn't simply students who needed support. Jews from all demographic backgrounds were suffering. And so I began to run support groups with Jewish adults through the US, and in time, a much larger initiative, the Jewish Community Mental Health Initiative, was born. And it was at that point that my work transitioned to running support groups for queer identified Jews, many of whom were literally being run out of their communities. So when I call myself an October 8th Jew, it's to say that I had a very painful collision with reality. And that's something awakened in me, an awareness, I think, of how the world related to my identity as a Jew and as a very proud Zionist. And I think for myself and many like me, the past 2.5 years have been something of a kind of symbolic death and rebirth.
Hmm. Thank you. Thank you. And I think your story is echoed among many people. When I first heard you speak, you gave a name to what so many of us in the Jewish community have been feeling and experiencing. Not only are we subject to anti-Semitism, we're sometimes gaslit to believe that what we experienced isn't even real. And then adding insult to injury, given litmus tests about our Jewish identity in Israel for belonging. At JCRC, we often talk about how our Jewish identity is conflated with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the result of this has been really, really dire. Just like you just described, I can't tell you how many people I know who have lost social circles, had to delete their social media accounts, and even lost close personal friends. We did a survey of Bay Area Jewish identity for the last few years, and our last survey found that 19%, so that's nearly 1 in 5 Jews in the Bay Area, made major life changes such as moving, switching jobs, or switching their kids from one school to another because of anti-Semitism. So that's a real impact. You have a psychological framework for the impact of what Jews are experiencing today. Could you please walk us through that and describe what that looks like?
Sure. For many in our community, October 7th and the experience since then have been what I call a kind of trauma trifecta. You have the horror of October 7th colliding with the intergenerational trauma that so many of us carry. And all of this is inflamed by ongoing daily stress and gaslighting. The daily stress that I'm talking about is the relentless bombardment of anti-Semitic material and experiences, largely through the news and social media, also known as digital anti-Semitism. But by no means is it confined to it. It happens in small and in large ways. It's the microaggressions at work and school. It's walking down Valencia Street and noticing no shortage of anti-Israel graffiti advocating for violence. It's your favorite coffee shop posting a from the river to the sea flyer. The list of these types of daily stressors, which impact our nervous system and activate our hypervigilance, really goes on and on. My colleagues at Gesher Community Care, and I'm going to talk about them later, they have this wonderful analogy. They liken it to being in the ocean in the midst of a storm, and wave after wave comes crashing down on you with little opportunity to catch your breath. And then there is the gaslighting, or as my colleague, Dr. Miri Bar-Halpern, refers to it as traumatic invalidation. And I want to offer some concrete examples of traumatic invalidation. So it occurs when you try to speak about your experience as a Jew and you're ignored, or when you're blamed or met with deflection and whataboutism. For example, someone saying, well, what about another group suffering? When your suffering is relativized by claims that Jews are white and inherently privileged, when a double standard is applied to your experience that would not be applied to another ethnic group, when you're told, for example, that you're being dramatic or overreacting, paranoid, or that your experience is too confusing. When you're told that Jews are truly not indigenous to the modern day state of Israel, or when you're ostracized from social or professional spaces, these are all classic examples of traumatic invalidation. In my mind, traumatic invalidation is the refusal to bear witness to the legitimate suffering of an individual or group. It's a violation and it's a trespassing that robs people of dignity. And it's uniquely suited to induce shame because the message that's conveyed is not that you should feel badly about something that you've done, but about who you are. So it's not uncommon in the face of these kinds of experiences to experience a fight, a flight, a fawn, or freeze response. Now, Both the daily stress and the traumatic invalidation I just described are amplified by this third factor, which is intergenerational trauma. And for those out there who don't know about intergenerational trauma, the study actually emerges in Israel in the late 1960s and the early 1970s as psychoanalysts are beginning to work with adult children of Holocaust survivors. And through this work, they come to understand that the psychological effects of traumatic experiences or historical memories, whether they be personal or collective, they can persist beyond those who directly endured them. So this phenomenon is observed not only in families of Holocaust survivors, but also among families of Mizrahi Jews who experienced atrocities such as the Farhud. And what the understanding points to is that there are layers of memory that lie dormant, memories that aren't entirely our own, which collapse the boundaries of time and space. So contemporary events like 10/7 can awaken them because for generations as Jews, we've carried the echoes of trauma, stories of pogroms, displacement, and targeted violence, which is passed down through families and communities. We know that the pain of previous generations doesn't simply fade. It actually imprints itself on descendants in ways that are both visible and unseen. And in these moments, we find ourselves not only grieving for what has happened today, we're actually grieving with our ancestors because the past isn't just history, it's actually very much present.
That makes a lot of sense. And, I'll just share a quick personal story about that, something that surprised me around historical or intergenerational trauma, which is I was traveling for the first time to Germany and we were in the airport and we saw German guards with guns yelling in German. And I had this like shock reaction that completely surprised me and I didn't understand. And, I looked deeper at it and I realized where this came from. Even though my family, we're not family of, I don't have Holocaust survivors in my immediate families, we have a lot of stories. And I watched a lot of TV and read a lot of books and I had this unconscious association. And, for me, that was an example, a real live example of how this intergenerational trauma can show up in different situations. It impacts how we react to different situations. So I'm curious, can you tell us like how else these three factors that you talked about show up in a clinical setting? And can you tell, in addition to that, a little more about what impacts these experiences on the lives of Jews? So how does it impact them in the workplace, in school, in their personal relationships, et cetera?
Well, not surprisingly, as Dr. Hibble noted in the last webinar of this series, rates of depression and anxiety are rising. But I actually want to focus on a few experiences that often receive less attention. The first is the profound sense of betrayal and abandonment felt by so many in our community within personal, political, and social justice circles. Jewish people have historically been at the forefront of civil rights and liberation movements. And to witness groups such as Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and the queer liberation movement fail to defend the humanity of Israelis facing terror, or even diasporic Jews confronting anti-Semitism, I think has been deeply gutting for a lot of us. There's also the tangible loss of personal relationships. We have a Pew study which indicates that 40% of Jews report having lost a relationship during this period. Many individuals have also shared with me that they miss their pre-October 7th selves and that the world no longer feels the same. There is a disbelief that the world has turned on them, and confusion, anger, and even rage, which may not be comfortable for many, are very common responses to this shift, along with a pervasive sense of homelessness and alienation in social work and political circles. Because the world now feels unfamiliar and potentially unsafe, there's an ongoing need to be hypervigilant, to constantly scan for anti-Semitism in new environments and to code switch to preserve safety. Um, Lastly, as part of the daily stress that I mentioned earlier, is the experience of perpetual loss. In one of my support groups, people would often begin by saying, "Well, I lost another one." And what they meant by that was within the span of a single week, they had learned of yet another individual they admired who said something inflammatory, or an organization they had supported for years that just couldn't bring itself to name anti-Semitism when describing an attack on Jews, or a professional conference where Israelis were disinvited, or even a bookstore that they had frequented, which created a hostile environment. So, week after week, these moments accumulated, creating a steady erosion of trust and belonging.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it puts in perspective why we see such a big increase in both anxiety and depression symptoms, because these things build up over the years. We also see these things like this leading to people hiding aspects of their Jewish identity. Putting the Star of David they might wear under their shirt when they go in circumstances, and really making a safety assessment everywhere they go. Is it safe to keep my kippah, or do I need to put a baseball hat on top of it? I can't remember the exact number, but some studies have been released recently that show that a majority of Jews have actually had these experiences where they've been in situations where they felt the need to hide their identity because of fear of things happening. So I want to switch over a little bit. So you wrote a letter to the editor in the Washington Post. The piece was entitled "Queer Spaces Should Be Open to Jews Like Me." Could you talk a little bit about what led you to write this article, and why is the queer experience in particular a relevant one when discussing anti-Semitism?
Yeah. The queer community has been profoundly impacted by October 7th, as some queer leaders have sought to intertwine the Palestinian cause with queer liberation. As a result, many queer Jews have been targeted, bullied, harassed, and expelled from queer spaces simply for their Jewish and or Zionist identities. A study by Eshel and A Wider Bridge reveals that 82%
Mhm.
of queer Jewish respondents report being harassed or even expelled in queer spaces, and 41% no longer frequent exclusively queer spaces. For many queer Jews, especially younger ones, navigating community, social justice, intimacy, and dating spaces, this experience carries an added layer of collective trauma and grief. For those of us in the LGBTQ community, traumatic invalidation around our Jewish and or Zionist identities can be especially painful because it's a reminder of personal spaces that have been violated before. For many of us, being queer is fundamental to who we are, and so is being Jewish and Zionist. Many queer Jews that I speak to describe the experience of sharing their Jewishness or Zionism as another form of coming out, a second coming out, if you will, that is fraught with uncertainty because they don't know if they're going to be embraced or ostracized. And the impact of this trauma on queer Jews has really been devastating. It's not uncommon to encounter queer Jews who have taken leaves of absence from college after being harassed for being visibly Jewish, or who are ignored or refuse service at LGBTQ community centers because they identify as Zionist. Many face abandonment by entire friend groups for refusing to renounce Israel, while others feel forced to leave the US, doubting that they could ever find an accepting queer community here. Some queer Jews have even reported to me that their non-Jewish partners have been ostracized for remaining in relationship with a Zionist individual. Dating has become fraught with profiles explicitly excluding Zionists. And even seeking mental health care can provoke fear of discrimination. This is a concern so widespread that I regularly receive calls from queer identified Jews in Canada struggling to find an appropriate therapist. And so the reality reflects a very deep and painful rupture. It's a violation not just of identity, but of something quite personal that should really never be trespassed.
Hmm. Yeah, when we talk about um, the kinds of anti-Semitism that Jews experience, we highlight that Jewish experience is very different because Jews are diverse, and many Jews, like queer Jews, have intersectional identity. So you're talking about layers of issues that they may experience, as you mentioned, first as a queer Jew, and then as a first as somebody who's queer, and then somebody who is Jewish. And so these issues really compound upon each other. And I imagine that this is particularly difficult in that community. So working for the Jewish community and working for JCRC Bay Area, I feel like I really have the benefit of working in a supportive environment with colleagues who care. But most people don't. We are as a community, we've done a great job cultivating spaces for Jews. We do a great job with that on campus. We do a great job of that in the wider community. But most people, most of their lives are not lived in those Jewish spaces. So I want to turn our attention a little bit to the more practical side of this conversation. So could you share some ideas, some practical suggestions for Jews who are experiencing the impacts of anti-Semitism, and particularly ways that they might continue to cultivate resilience to what they're experiencing?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what resilience is and what it isn't. Resilience is it's not a fixed trait. It's an ongoing process of coping and adapting. Think about it as a psychic muscle that requires regular tending to. I would say that feeling the profound impact of the past 2.5 years, whether as daily stress or as the traumatic invalidation that I described, this is not a failure of resilience. Rather, resilience is the steady daily work of responding to and adjusting to present circumstances. When we talk about resilience, it helps to think of it as something that lives in layers. It lives in our environment, so that's what we take in. It lives in our community, that's who we stand with. It lives in our mind, that's the meaning that we make, and it lives in our bodies, how we regulate and how we move. And resilience isn't just located in one of these places, it's really sustained when we tend to all of them. So, as I also discussed earlier, some of us are recipients of intergenerational trauma, but this is really important. We're also the recipients of intergenerational resilience. And I really do believe that this capacity is one of our birthrights as Jewish people. It's been carried forward across nearly 3,000 years, beginning with our first exile, and continually cultivated through our collective ability to endure, adapt, and survive. I'd also say that our historical memory doesn't just hold only pogroms and displacement, it also carries countless moments of courage, resilience, resistance, creativity, and renewal. So we inherit not only the memories of suffering, we also inherit the memories of coping. That all being said, the first practical strategy that I would recommend, and this may come as no surprise, concerns news consumption and social media. We have to be discerning about how much potentially activating material we allow ourselves to absorb. Digital anti-Semitism, I feel, has become a kind of psychological smog through which our community is constantly moving through. And it's essential to know your limits, what you can reasonably take in on a daily basis. Not every headline deserves your nervous system, and not every comment requires your engagement. Conserve your energy by intentionally seeking out cleaner spaces online, places where you can breathe more freely. Beyond limiting exposure to the smog, we can also strengthen ourselves by regularly engaging in Jewish communal spaces, both online and in person. I believe that one of the greatest psychological threats facing our community right now is isolation and alienation. So, whether it's a WhatsApp group, a synagogue, a JCC, a Hillel, a Jewish ERG, or some combination of these, finding daily ways to be with other Jews, spaces where you don't have to explain yourself, you don't have to rationalize your identity, code switch, stay on guard, or hide. This is essential. These are really spaces where you can share your experience, especially your emotions, and where you can experience what I call peoplehood. So, peoplehood is clicking into something larger than the individual self. It's a felt sense of belonging to an ongoing collective across time and geography, because resilience is rarely built alone. It's actually co-regulated by community. In addition, I would pay attention to which activities, relationships, and settings nourish you and which deplete you. Notice also how you interpret what's happening around you and how you make meaning of it. We have a large body of research in psychology which shows us that what we tell ourselves about a situation significantly shapes how we experience it, not just emotionally, but physiologically too. So there's a meaningful difference between thinking to yourself, everything is falling apart and I'm totally alone, versus thinking, okay, this is painful and this is frightening, but it's not the first time our people have faced this and I don't have to face it alone. The external factors may be the same, but the psychological impact is not. Another practical layer of resilience is planning ahead when you know that you're entering a potentially stressful situation. So, this could be a meeting with a difficult colleague, a social gathering after a rupture, even a family event with people who have caused harm. Rather than walking in braced and reactive, create a simple resilience plan for yourself. So, beforehand, ideally, you want to steady your nervous system. You can check in with a supportive friend. You can practice a few minutes of box breathing. You can move your body or engage in a grounding ritual. Small acts of preparation, like the one that I just described, actually communicate safety to the body. During the interaction itself, try to anchor yourself with one or two quiet phrases. You can say to yourself internally, this is temporary. I can remain steady even if this is uncomfortable. If you're a tactile person and a tactile cue helps, you can hold a small object that calms you, or even keep a photo on your phone of someone or even your pet, something that symbolizes comfort and strength and continuity. And afterwards, you want to plan for recovery. Take a walk, return to breath work, maybe journal, meet a trusted friend to process and reconnect. Resilience, I would say, is not only about enduring the moment, it's about how you intentionally restore yourself after it. So, anticipation, regulation, and recovery, this is resilience enacted in real time. And I just want to say, we're seeing this vividly in the accounts of the Israeli hostages who survived prolonged captivity because they anchored themselves in intentional thought, memory, ritual, and small acts of meaning making that help preserve a sense of self in conditions which were designed to strip that sense of self away. So it's not to romanticize suffering or suggest that positive thinking eliminates trauma. Rather, it shows us the human capacity to preserve selfhood even under extreme duress. And lastly, because I'm trying to be mindful of time, I want to highlight movement as a quiet but powerful form of protective resilience. Again, we have a large body of research in psychology which shows us that regular physical activity, believe it or not, can be as effective as antidepressants for mild to moderate depression. So it doesn't mean that medication isn't important or necessary for some. It absolutely is. But what it teaches us is that resilience does not only reside in our thoughts, it actually lives in our bodies as well. So movement helps us discharge stress, restore with rhythm, and importantly, I think, reclaim a sense of agency, especially in the face of helplessness.
Thank you. Thank you. Those are some really, I think, practical tips that hopefully everyone can remember when they're facing these situations. When you mentioned the hostages, and one thing that had struck me listening to some of the interviews with them is how ritual really helped them maintaining that sense of Jewish ritual, whether it was lighting symbolic Shabbat candles or other things, really kept them grounded and kept them going. I do have one follow-up question, which is, are there some situations that people may be faced with where they really should just walk away? Like things that, where are some of the situations that people really should not put themselves through, and when would they know, and how would they potentially do that?
Yeah, I think you're always doing a kind of cost benefit analysis.
Mhm.
Certainly, if you do not feel physically or emotionally safe, you want to walk away. But what I typically say to people is think about the relationship that's in front of you. Is this some guy at the dog park who you really don't want to engage with and you're never going to see again? Or is this a trusted friend where there is a history of mutual love, respect, and trust, and you want to fight for the relationship? Because as we all know, as it relates to our Jewish identity, it's so raw and it's so vulnerable, and we're going to be risking the heart. So I would say if this is a colleague that you have to work with, right? Or if this is a trusted friend or a beloved family member, maybe those are the situations after you do your own cost benefit analysis that you want to proceed with. If it's just some random person or someone who you're never going to see again, probably best to walk away, but I think every person has to decide for themselves.
hmm hmm One other tip, which is not maybe not a psychological tip, but one other tip that I think is really important, which is to pause before you do anything. You pause before you write that email, or that response, and think about it. Is this really what I want to say? Is this really, especially in the context of a close and personal relationship, maybe we need to just sleep on it, and think about it. Sometimes it can be cathartic just to write that and delete it. So that's a tip I often give folks, because a lot of times we're really caught up in the emotion of the moment or the argument, and we may say or do things that that probably didn't help our situation
Yeah, yeah.
particularly.
Sleep on it is generous. Sometimes I say give it 3 to 5 business days.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about resiliency and being flexible. None of having the psychological impacts, experiencing anxiety, all of this is a natural reaction to what is going on. This is a human reaction, and we really encourage everyone to seek support. There is definitely help available. So I want to turn our attention to where that help is. So first of all, we have each one of our regions has local Jewish family and children's services. That they have a range of individual therapy, support groups, and others available to the community. So Tal's going to put some links in the chat for those of you that would like some more information and to follow up. But Josh, if you could please share other resources that you're aware of nationally, particularly for someone who may be hesitant to seek out help based on negative experiences or concerns about therapists being culturally competent to work with Jews, or someone who may need financial assistance and can't afford to see a therapist.
Yeah, as for resources, I want to make a couple of suggestions. The first is Gesher Community Care.
Mhm.
Gesher was created by doctors Jessica Smood and Shelley Steinwurzel in response to the rise in anti-Semitism following October 7th, but also in the mental health community. Gesher is a national network of mental health professionals who are actually trained in Jewish cultural competency and abide by the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And Gesher's mission is to make therapy not just accessible, but also affordable. So to do so, they offer subsidies to reduce the costs for clients who demonstrate need. The second resource is the Jewish Community Mental Health Initiative. And I actually think we're going to put a link to
Mhm.
JCMHI, the initiative, in the chat, but we are also going to give a list of the current support groups that they offer. JCMHI is a tremendous resource for our community. They currently offer 25 free weekly virtual support groups for any Jew around the world who can access a Zoom link. The groups are ongoing. They're staffed by licensed clinicians who are in weekly consultation, and there is no need for a weekly commitment, meaning you can show up one week, take a couple weeks off, go back for 2 weeks, and then take a break. And again, they are a wonderful resource for the community. I think there are 25 groups currently running, which should be in the chat, and they're free and staffed by licensed clinicians.
Great, thank you. So there's a lot of resources out there. There's some that you can find locally in person, others online. Really encourage you to take a look at all these resources. Tal should also be putting in a link to our JCRC's Here I Am webpage and our Here I Am stories. The Here I Am stories has a number of other resources, not only to therapists, but also to a number of other information, educational materials, et cetera, around anti-Semitism. So please take a look at that. So before we turn to Q&A, I have one last question for you, which is, where do you think we are heading as a community?
So let me return to where I began. You may recall that when I began speaking, I named three trauma-related responses that my colleagues and I have observed in the Jewish community over the past 2.5 years. And I want to add one more to that list, something I believe many of us are currently in or working towards, and something that my Israeli colleagues at ICAR have begun to promote as of late, and that's post-traumatic growth, which is the positive psychological change, believe it or not, that can occur as a result of trauma. So, post-traumatic growth often includes a deeper appreciation for life, stronger relationships, greater personal strength, and an increased sense of collective identity. Many individuals come to recognize their own resilience and perceive themselves as stronger, more capable, and better able to face adversity than before. In the process, people may also feel more anchored to their community and culture, drawing meaning and strength from shared history and vulnerability. Individuals also develop a clearer understanding of their values and a renewed commitment to purposeful action in the aftermath of trauma. So, post-traumatic growth typically is described in five movements. The first is that there is a radical acceptance of the trauma that occurred in the community. The second is that there is an increased sense of safety because the trauma has concluded. In our case, it would be a ceasefire and the return of the hostages. The third is that there is a creation of new narratives about who we now are as a result of the trauma. The fourth is that there is an integration of our pre and post trauma selves. And the fifth one is that there is the wisdom and growth that results from this integration and transformation. But what's critical to understand is that these movements, they don't happen in isolation. They begin in conversation like the one that we're having now in spaces where we can fully encounter one another. We often say in psychology that trauma occurs alone while recovery takes place in relationship and community. And we're still very much in the middle of this story. Post-traumatic growth, it doesn't mean that the pain is over or that clarity has arrived. It just means that we're beginning to ask different questions about how we live, who we trust, and where we belong. And again, those answers are not going to emerge alone. They're going to emerge here in community, in conversation, and really in the willingness to keep showing up for one another.
Thank you. So we have a lot of great questions in the Q&A. So I think I'll divide them into, uh, group them into different topic areas. So the first one I want to talk about is reactions to things that happen in the community. So one of the examples somebody gave is signs that somebody read saying anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. And the reaction to that, is, well, how does, somebody decide what anti-Semitism is for a Jew? And this can be very difficult when you see things like that or you hear statements like that coming from the community. How do you know how to react? How do you respond in a calm way to statements like that without it, really triggering I guess triggering your anger essentially, or, ending up in a conversation that's not productive. I
Sure.
know you teach about nonviolent communication. We certainly don't have time to do an entire lesson about that, but if
Yeah.
you can give folks a few clues or a few tips for how to have these conversations when they see something that's really triggering and difficult for them.
Sure, sure. Well, what you described is actually an example of what's called epistemic anti-Semitism, which means that Jews cannot be trusted to accurately report on their experience, and that there are individuals in the community, many who are non-Jews, who seem to believe that they know better than members of our community. Again, I think before you react, you want to pause. You want to take a deep breath. Maybe you want to step away for a bit and you want to try to evaluate the situation clearly. If you have a buddy with you, maybe you converse for a bit. But again, is it really worth it? Is this an individual that you know, right? I think all of us over the past 2.5 years, especially those of us who have lost relationships, we've seen individuals who we thought were close friends post inflammatory things on Facebook, right? So again, the question, do a cost benefit analysis. Is this a relationship that I want to fight for? Or is this some individual, again, on Valencia Street, who is known to flyer the street day after day with inflammatory rhetoric? As for nonviolent communication, it is something that folks can Google. It's something often that I devote a whole hour to. But very quickly, nonviolent communication was actually developed by a Jewish psychologist named Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, late 1960s, early 1970s. He was brought in to desegregate high schools, and he developed a form of communication that is meant to de-escalate and meant to reduce shame. When he talks about violent communication, what he means is that you're judging someone or you're shaming them. So nonviolent communication has four parts, and I'll run through it very quickly. The first one is an observation, right? When someone posts something on Facebook, when someone says something hurtful, you would say, when you said X, I really felt hurt. The second part is your feeling. You're not blaming, you're not accusing, you're talking from your own experience. The third part is the need that you have. When you posted that on Facebook, I felt hurt. I need to feel safe in our relationship. And the fourth is a request, right? Are you asking them not to say it again? Are you asking them not to do it again? Maybe you even want to ask them to read an article which might change their perspective. Those are the tenets of nonviolent communication. The observation of the objective thing that happened, the feeling it promoted in you, what you need in the relationship, and then what is your request moving forward.
Thanks. Those are great, great tips. Um,
And folks can Google nonviolent communication, and there are plenty of worksheets out there.
That's great. That's great. In fact, there's actually a question in the chat, or not really a question, but somebody would love a summary of all of the kinds of concepts and the tips and the advice that you're talking about. Is there anything that you can point to, anything that's been written that talks a little bit about, particularly the tips you gave for building resiliency? Is there anything out there that we can send to folks or that they can look up online?
Absolutely. Certainly, there's a document that I can compile. I mentioned ICAR, which is an Israeli organization, Israel's Collective Action for Resilience. They have some wonderful tips on resiliency. So I would point people to ICAR, and Karen, you and I can certainly create something and send that out as well if that would be helpful.
Great, great. Thank you. So there's another group of questions. We focused a lot on um, Jews' experience primarily in the public sphere, but Jews are also experiencing anti-Semitism within their own community. And
Mhm.
so we know that, Jews also can do and say things that are anti-Semitic, and Jews can do things that are hurtful and traumatic to each other. So, do you have any tips or thoughts around how you might handle that or deal with it, particularly when you feel like you're really being questioned within what's supposed to be a safe space or your own community?
Mhm. Certainly, and I think this is why earlier, one of the things that I pointed to in terms of being in Jewish communal spaces, I would say the majority of one's time spent in Jewish communal spaces should really be with like-minded Jews, precisely for this reason. I think there is a time to engage and debate when one feels as if they have the energy and the wherewithal to do so. But I think many of us feel run down 2.5 years in. I think many of us don't want to be doing that most of the time, which is why it is important when we spend time in Jewish communal spaces to do it with like-minded Jews, where again, we don't have to rationalize, we don't have to defend, we don't have to code switch. As it relates to being in spaces with Jews that you feel, I often say they're not necessarily anti-Semitic. I typically say they may perpetuate anti-Semitism. Again, I think each individual has to decide for themselves, to what degree do you want to engage? Is this an individual who is not just going to listen to you, but is going to make an attempt to understand you? Those are two very different things. Nowadays, I feel like people listen, but they don't seek to understand. And this brings us back to traumatic invalidation. I think people are so inclined to instinctually respond and refuse to bear witness to the Jewish experience, to the Zionist experience. So if that's something that you are willing to risk tolerating, by all means. But if you're not, I do think one should spend more time in Jewish communal spaces where you don't have to defend yourself in that way, because frankly, I think most Jews feel as if they are constantly defending themselves against the world at large on a daily basis.
Hmm. Yeah, makes sense. Do you have any advice for how Jewish institutions or how rabbis or other clergy can support the community with any of this?
Absolutely. I think be available again, not just to listen, but to understand, but to understand. And the importance, obviously, we know this in our religious tradition, the importance of bearing witness to another, just making some time for another to share their experience, whether it's acute, whether it's chronic, the willingness to understand. That goes a long way. I think people often underestimate how deeply healing that can be. Again, especially for Jews who, at least as it's reported to me in this city, walk around and feel as if they suffer traumatic invalidation, not once a day, but several times a day.
Mhm. Thank you. So let's turn our attention over to there's a number of questions around children and family. Um,
Mhm.
so one of these questions, or a couple of these questions actually really focus on differences of opinion within families, and particularly a younger generation that may have a different perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, may have a different perspective on, their experiences with anti-Semitism. How do you maintain those bonds when it is so close to home, when it's something so deeply personal?
It's a tough question, in large part because I've heard countless stories of families that have fragmented because of this very issue. Again, I would not be inclined to have such conversations between generations until both parties are ready and that both parties have agreed to listen and to try to understand the other one. I often recommend nonviolent communication as a technique for families. In my line of work, it's considered the best practice in all relationships. Try to find commonalities, try to build bridges, try to find what can both generations, what can both parties agree on, and start from there. And again, refrain from judging, refrain from accusing, refrain from telling any Jew they're not Jewish enough or they're doing it wrong. That's only going to alienate them, especially the younger generation. You want to try to create a space where, again, especially the younger generation feels safe and comfortable coming forward to other members of their family and to the elders and sharing their experience and being curious. A younger person saying to their mother, their father, hey, I heard about this thing. It's really troubling to me. What do you think about that? Those are the kinds of spaces that you want to open up and provide. You don't want to leave a younger person with the sense that I just can't talk to mom or dad or whoever because I'm going to get the same old shtick from them. It's just not helpful.
Hmm. And also, when you go into the conversation with the mindset, I'm going to change this person's mind and I'm going to convince them how I'm right. That is not, at least speaking as a parent, that is definitely not a productive way to enter a conversation with your child. So, let's stick with talking to kids. So there's a couple more questions. One is, first of all, how do we talk to our kids about anti-Semitism? And then what are some of the things that we can do to build resilience in our children and grandchildren?
Yeah, in terms of working with children, this is something that I'm hoping there will be a different webinar on because it really deserves an hour, and it's particularly complex and specific. It's specific because it has much to do with the developmental stage, the developmental station of your child, and what can they reasonably take in. So again, we're always doing a kind of cost-benefit analysis with kids. What information can we share with them will promote awareness and resilience that is developmentally appropriate? And what information would probably steal something precious from their childhood? That's not something we would want to do. In general, what I recommend with children, especially after something like what happened in Australia, is you do want to ask them what they've heard. You can then fill in the rest, but you want to emphasize that they are safe, they are not alone, they are protected, and most importantly, anti-Semitism is not who Jews are. Anti-Semitism is what's done to Jews. And again, based on the developmental station of your child, and maybe we will have the opportunity in a different webinar to talk more specifically, you can then move from that kind of template.
And along the lines of building resiliency.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I think bringing children to Jewish community events, I think bringing in Jewish music, bringing in Jewish text, bringing in Jewish games, a celebration of the holidays, even if you're not religiously inclined. I also think identifying Jewish mentors, Jewish heroes in the community, in the thing that your kids love. I think that's a wonderful way, especially because children are very much in the stage where they're in identity formation, right? They're figuring out who they want to be and who they're becoming. And so you can bring in Jewish influence and Jewish pride in those ways.
Thank you. We have a couple similar questions for older children, so college age children,
Yeah.
some of who are, in some of the this one of the surveys that you mentioned, have really felt the impacts of anti-Semitism, many of whom are feeling much more isolated. So do you have any tips for, college students who may be having a really rough time?
Yeah, I think my best tip, practically speaking, is to find a Hillel or to find some other Jewish organization for an immediate sense of safety. And certainly that individual can see are there social possibilities within those groups. I do also want to throw out the Jewish Community Mental Health Initiative, which I do believe has at least a couple of support groups meant to support students. I am glad to say, based on what I've heard, I think some of the anti-Semitic activity and certainly the encampments on college campuses are beginning to die down. They're at least not as explicit. I'm also hearing this about SF. People are saying to me they're seeing less kafiyas, they're seeing less Free Palestine signs. So I think college kids are beginning to recover somewhat from what they were exposed to over the past 2.5 years. But I think if they can make contact with and anchor themselves in a Jewish organization, that would be a good start.
Thanks. So we have a question that's talking about career paths, and I think it's an interesting question because we have heard at JCRC, we've heard from a number of people, particularly in certain career paths, either, just starting off, maybe they're still in school, maybe they're doing internships, and others, particularly in the medical fields, the psychological fields, the social work fields, you alluded to this earlier, that have experienced a lot of problems in their workplace. And do you have any suggestions for folks that are, considering, I don't know, should I limit or should I change the career that I'm thinking about going into based on anti-Semitism?
Yeah. Again, I think it's a deeply personal question,
Mhm.
right? I think the individual probably has to do a whole lot of thinking. It does seem to me, for example, next month is the Stand With Us conference, and I'm going to be speaking on a panel regarding anti-Semitism in healthcare. It does seem to me as if it's not just our Jewish community at large that is beginning to contract and find its voice and start speaking up and demand changes. There also seem to be Jews in all different professions who are finding each other, who are developing Jewish ERGs, for example. I've heard about so many Jewish ERGs over the past 2 years that have developed in all kinds of companies and organizations. And so it does seem to me as if the Jews are finding each other, they're
Mhm.
beginning to speak up, and they are developing safe spaces. So I can't think of unless you want to be a progressive activist, I think you're probably going to be okay. But I think if progressive activism is really your calling, you may want to think twice about that, or at the very least, align yourself with a Jewish progressive cause, say like the Zionist movement.
And can you just explain, there was actually a question, what is an ERG?
Oh, that is an employee resource group. So Jewish, and often they are affinity based. So Jewish employee resource groups are developing all over the country in various companies and organizations, in large part because of the anti-Semitism that Jewish employees have experienced in the workplace post 10/7.
I'd love to hear that because one of the things that we've noticed is many companies don't include uh, Jewish ERGs. And some of the reasoning is, well, we don't do any religious ERGs, which points to a fundamental misunderstanding about what Jewish identity is. And that Jews have often been put in ERGs that don't really align with their own identity. So to hear that more and more companies are building Jewish ERGs, I think is a really positive move, and it's a great way to get support. And to deal with some of the things that many of us have felt.
That's right. And if there is an individual out there who is at a company that doesn't have a Jewish ERG, they may want to consider starting one. Yeah, that's how it happens.
Great. Just a very specific question, which is, can you attend groups if you already have a therapist? Some people are expressing that they don't have a therapist they feel comfortable with, and,
Uh-huh.
can you do both?
You can absolutely tend a free virtual support group. The support groups, however, are not therapy. They are meant to provide support. And certainly, if you already have a therapist, you're more than welcome to, in addition, attend a support group.
Okay, great. So I think we're just about running out of time. So I just want to thank you tremendously for, I think you've provided a lot of guidance and a lot of information. We will put together the resources that we've mentioned, that we've put in the chat, and send them out in a follow-up email. We're also recording this session and plan to to release this along with a recording of the session that we did last month. JCRC Bay Area is also putting together additional programming coming up in the future on this topic and related topics. So please stay tuned. And do you have any final closing words for those here today that you'd like to share before we part?
Well, thank you for having me. And as an October 8th Jew, it is a privilege, really an honor to be part of the Bay Area Jewish community. Over the past 2.5 years, I have witnessed tremendous strength, bravery, and resilience. So truly an honor to be here with
Absolutely.
everybody.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And good night, everyone.